A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hello there, David McKnight. Welcome to the Power of Zero show. You can find me at davidmcknight.com. I'm the best-selling author of The Power of Zero. Look before you lerp. I've got an upcoming book that will be coming out in the next month or so. Stay tuned for more information on that. Grateful that you're with us. Today we're going to talk about something that I love talking about. That's what we call the fiscal gap. Fiscal gap is a concept that has been championed by two PhD economists, Larry Collicof out of Boston University and Allan Arback from Berkeley. And the basic gist of the fiscal gap, or what we call fiscal gap accounting, is this. The federal government has stated, that's what they call the publicly stated debt. They have stated that our national debt is $22 trillion. Now, while some people say that's a big number and it's growing out of control and it could someday cripple our economy, fiscal gap accounting actually tells us that that number is actually much, much bigger than what they're telling us. Fiscal gap basically is the difference between everything that we've promised over the course of the next 70 years or so and what we can actually afford to pay. And Larry Collicof and Allan Arback express the fiscal gap as a present value of a future obligation. Put differently, how much money would we have to have in a savings account today, earning treasury rates, say 3%, to be able to afford everything that we are required to pay for by law, things that we have to pay for unless politicians can get together and change these laws, which they haven't shown very much commitment to doing over the course of time. So according to, when we interviewed Allan Arback and Larry Collicof in our movie, The Power of Zero, The Tax Train is Coming, they said that the fiscal gap, and this is in 2018, was $222 trillion. Okay. So we tell everybody that the national debt is growing by, $1 trillion to $2 trillion per year. According to what the numbers they've done, when you figure all of the math into that $222 trillion number, it's not growing at $2 trillion per year. It's actually growing at $6 trillion per year. So the fiscal gap, why is it a responsible thing to discuss the fiscal gap? Why do they prefer to express our national debt in terms of a fiscal gap, in terms of what the government actually tells us, which is the $22 trillion? Well, the reason why it's a responsible thing to do is because, number one, every other country in the world is doing it. We tell people that our fiscal gap we tell people that our actual debt to GDP ratio is about 106%. And it was, by the way, much worse than World War II, so we got nothing to worry about. So the reality is we really need to understand to get a true vision of the fiscal condition of our country, we need to express our national debt in the same way that everybody else in the world is expressing it, and in the same way that 20 Nobel laureates within the borders of our own country have endorsed. And that's to say, hey, look, if we were a private corporation, we would have to list every debt that we have on our book, on our balance, on our ledger, as it were. We currently don't do that. We only express the debt that we actually owe. And we owe two different types of debt. We have what's called intragovernmental debt, which is money that we've borrowed from Social Security, for example. That's about $6 trillion. And then we have the other $16 trillion that we've borrowed from the public, which includes American citizens, other countries like China. Did you know we only owe China, a little bit more than $1 trillion, and Saudi Arabia and Japan? So we owe $22 trillion, some of it to the public, some of it to our, to the government itself. We borrow it from Social Security. So it's the more responsible thing to do to not just state what we currently have on the books in terms of real debt. We have to also express what we've promised, but what we can't afford to deliver. What is the future cost of all of these expenditures? And let's subtract that from the future income that we're going to be generating from income producing assets and from taxes and from things like that over time. So the gap is pretty big. And in 2018, they expressed that gap as $2 222 trillion. Well, something interesting happened in the last week or so, and that's that Larry Collicof and Allan Arback actually revised their projection. They actually said the real fiscal gap is no longer 222 trillion. The real fiscal gap is 239 trillion, meaning that either it was understated or this reduction in revenue that we have experienced and the future debt obligations along with all of the interests that go along with it have so compromise their original projections as to render them irrelevant, and that we now have a fiscal gap of 239 trillion. This is a big deal because if you read further in their conclusions, they basically say, hey, look, if nothing else happens, if Congress does nothing, they neither raise revenue nor reduce spending over the course of the next 10 years, then there will come a day of reckoning. And 10 years from now, according to their math, they will have to raise revenue by 51% and reduce spending by 35%. So I've always said you either have to double taxes, reduce spending by half, or some combination of the two. Well, guess what? That's exactly what they're saying. They're saying if you were to combine, not just resort to raising revenue, not just resort to reducing spending, but a combination of the two, you're basically increasing taxes by 50% and you're reducing revenue by 35%, which will take a toll on a lot of different Americans. And what does this have to do with the power of zero? Well, it has everything to do with the power of zero. We've long maintained that tax rates in the future are going to be dramatically higher than they are today. And what the news from Larry Collicof and Allan Arback just in the last week or so is that it's much worse than we thought. Okay. We're going to have to probably raise revenue even higher than we anticipated, reduce spending by even more than we anticipated, given that the fiscal gap is much worse than they had previously suspected. So for those of you who are out there and you're not quite convinced that tax rates are going up, take it from these two PhDs who are really good at math that have really crunched the numbers. Look, if you're tempted, if you're currently in a 10, a 12, a 22 or 24% tax bracket, and you're tempted to put money into a 401k and an IRA, to get a deduction at today's historically low tax rates, only to postpone the payment of those taxes till 10 years from now when these folks are telling us that tax rates are going to be dramatically higher than they are today, then you probably have to think twice about it. Why would you want to get a deduction at historically low tax rates? Okay. You have plenty of money with which to pay the tax. We are at historically low tax rates, and we know that tax rates could be dramatically higher down the road. So you will look back 10 years from now. You will look back at the year 2019 and say the tax rates back then were a good deal of historical proportions. I can't believe that I put all that money into my 401k and IRA in order to get that tax deduction. Now I'm stuck with the bill. Remember, when you put money into your IRA or 401k, it's like going into a business partnership with the IRS. And every year they get to vote on what percentage of your profits they get to keep. Now, Larry Collicof and Allan Arback are looking into their crystal ball and they're saying, look, 10 years from now, 51% increase in tax rates, 35% reduction in spending. And when I say reduction in spending, what are we talking about? We're talking about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Those are the types of things they're going to be cutting back on. So, by the way, one thing you'll notice, politicians love to make promises. They're talking about how we need to have Medicare for all, basically universal health care. We need to forgive student debt. We need to have free college tuition. And I'm not here to argue the merits of all those things. I'm not here to argue the merits, for example, of universal basic income. I'm just here to say that when they're telling us that our national debt is $22 trillion, which is already a crisis, yet the actual national debt is $239 trillion. I don't think that politicians are making promises that they can actually deliver on. I don't think that they're being smart about how they are planning on handling the fiscal or the finances of our country. We can't afford to pay for the things that we've already promised, let alone piling on top all of these other promises that there's no way in a million years we could ever afford to pay. So keep that in mind as you're listening to politicians. Listen to it through those filters. We can't afford this stuff. And certainly when you're making decisions about where are you going to invest money for retirement? Do I really want to get this deduction at today's historically low tax rates? There's a good chance. Now, I'm going to tell you this. As you know, I've had arguments with people online, friendly arguments, of course, about the wisdom of getting deductions at today's historically low tax rates, and things like that. I'm not telling you that if you're in a 37% tax bracket or a 35 or even a 32 right now, that you should necessarily forego that tax deduction. After all, if you live in California and you're in the highest marginal tax rate, that's 37, throw in another 13% on top for state tax. That's a 50% tax deduction that you would be foregoing, okay, by listening to what I'm telling you right now. What I'm telling you is that if you're in a 10, a 12, a 22, or a 24% tax bracket, that you should probably not be putting money into IRAs and 401ks. If you want to get the match from your employer, put it into your Roth 401k. Don't put it into your traditional 401k. I think that we will look back 10 years from now and say those were great tax rates. Tax rates were on sale. That was the tax sale of a lifetime. I can't believe that I forewent that I took the tax deduction only to be stuck with the tax bill today. Remember, when you're putting money into an IRA or 401k, you're going into a business partnership with the IRS. Every year they get to vote on what percentage of your profits they get to keep. So that's our discussion on the fiscal gap today. The bad news is it's much worse than we thought. The good news is you are now armed with the knowledge on how to combat the insidious effects of future increases in tax rates. Anyway, thanks for being on the show today. We will look forward to talking to you next week.